Super excited to be here, guys. Fellow Victorian, so I'm expecting most of you are really excited to be back to in-person events as well. I have had the pleasure to have a few events across APAC, and it's been pretty interesting to sort of see the different COVID restrictions across APAC. I'm not going to talk about COVID, but just want to say the disclaimer, I am up here due to a COVID cancellation. So if you get feedback forms, just keep that in mind, please. Right? A little bit about myself. I've been pretty well traveled, so very fortunate in that regard. Worked across a number of continents, number of countries, number of verticals, different organizations, from two-person startups all the way to one of the largest GSIs. Got a couple of kids that keep me really busy. As you can tell by the accent, I'm not native, so we've got, I think, 8 passports in the household, so it's pretty interesting when the World Cup comes to town. Anyway, enough about me. Let's jump with it. So I want to spend a little bit of time around setting a bit of context around the state of APIs, the current state of APIs, the current state of API security and why that's breaking down. Spend a little bit of time around shift left and shield right, and I've got a friend at the back that's playing buzzword bingo, so if you've got your bingo things, keep with it. And then how we can connect those two together. You know, often we hear about elements of friction between DevOps and DevSecOps. And so anything we can do to try and reduce that friction, increase velocity, and improve security quality is generally quite well received. And hopefully I'll have a bit of time and a bit for Q&A. So no doubt, throughout today, you've probably heard, can everybody hear me all right? Okay, perfect. We all hear about digital transformation, digital twinning, digital decoupling, digital everything, right? And a lot of that's powered and driving demand for APIs. So I'll expect you guys all here pretty well versed in APIs. To me, it's all about agility, business agility, being first to market, being first to be able to respond to different market conditions, being first to respond to different client requirements. In my previous life, I used to talk about the market of one, talking about hyper-personalization and how that's moved away from the traditional static apps and web pages and content to now being a lot more dynamic, and pushing that out into our digital ecosystems and partnerships to really try and enrich that user experience. Now, of course, this dynamic approach has necessitated a whole bunch of other things, right? So I think I picked up in the last session, they were talking about, was it Frappy? Consumer data rights, so open banking, fintech, My Health Records, always a topical one to talk about. Just think about the FI data, EFI data, all the things that are out there that are driven by APIs, further exasperated by the stuff that it's typically deployed across multiple clouds and multiple stakeholders. Right? A little bit of a joke, got my quote of the day today from an API as well. Pretty topical, as you can hear from the accent again. I'm from Zimbabwe, which those of you who aren't so good at geography, it's the northern neighbor of South Africa. And I went to university in the Eastern Cape of South Africa during the Nelson Mandela era. But my point being is APIs are prolific. Whether we realize it or not, it's ubiquitous everywhere. And as a result, the attack surface at a macro level has grown exponentially, whereas organizations' ability to respond to that is lagging somewhat behind. You throw in some regulatory changes. From personal experience, once again, I've been in APAC a bit recently, and the central bank in the Philippines are lagging a little bit behind where we are in terms of open banking. But due to the COVID and the quick acceleration from bricks and mortars through to digital channels in the banking, they've actually released a memorandum earlier this year specifically focusing around API security. All right. If you can find skilled people, which is also a challenge in today's market, you can see by the graph that even incremental additions to staff is no ways going to keep with the exponential growth of the security gap. To put some numbers behind it, we partnered with 451 Research, who's part of the S&P Global, and surveyed predominantly Western and American and Western Europe organizations. And some of the numbers came back I thought were very interesting, and hopefully you do too. In terms of the use of APIs, the average number of APIs in those organizations was over 15,000, and had gone through almost a 200% growth in the last 12 months. So even if we conservatively take a fifth of that, it's still huge amounts of APIs that are in our environments. Of that, 41 also said they had an incident of some nature in the last 12 months. So API security incidents are becoming more common. 63% of those said it was a data breach or data loss. So if in a regulated industry, notifiable breaches, that can obviously have negative consequences. Also interesting, a little bit touching back on the topic about shift left. So 35% of the projects were delayed due to API security concerns. Yet interestingly, 87% believed that more effective API testing would have mitigated those results. Right? And that's why API security really has been such a hot topic in the news, with Gartner predicting in 2022 that it's going to be the #1 attack vector. IBM reporting similar, that almost 2/3 of incidents were due to improper configuration. And that's pretty concerning, right? I mean, it's just misconfiguration. And who takes responsibility from that in terms of development or security or the cloud or infra team? All the analysts seem to have reported on the growing importance of API security. And likewise, companies of all sizes have been affected, especially some of those that have deep pockets and very sophisticated security teams. So I want to transition a little bit into why security for APIs are broken down. So from a coding perspective, I know it's a little bit generalized, so apologies to any coders in the room, but generally centered on functionality first and have limited understanding of API-specific risks. Excessive data exposure is a classic example. Let's code for use and reuse. So let's provide all the fields and let's rely on the UI or the front end to filter out what they need. A very humorous story about that, and feel free to go and Google it, is that was exactly the exploit that resulted in Tony Abbott's passport number and mobile number being exposed when he came back from Japan and posted a selfie of his boarding ticket, right? And I find it's really interesting because of the simplicity of it. It's not as though it's any really very experienced deep dark web hacker. Just followed the bouncy ball a little bit, and each incremental bit of information helped him to go another step further, then another step further. Sticking with coding, I think we've gone through this transition of where we used to sort of develop first and then document later, and then there was stock controls saying, well, no, you need to do a spec first, and we'll code to the spec. And now we've gone back around to some extreme programming and fail fast and experimentation. So some between all those different approaches, there is definitely a building up of documentational debt. Right? Moving to deploy, the whole DevOps process, right? It's all about velocity. Let's release quicker, let's release faster. I was chatting to an insurance company quite recently, and they've got 300 odd releases at the end of each sprint. And what they're hoping to do is to kind of get from code to production within an hour. It's kind of like their North Star, right? And I know some people say, well, we do loads of it. In their particular environment, I think there was 6 to 8 weeks was their typical release cycle, mostly because of pen testing. So they were quite rigorous in terms of scheduling pen testing. So scarce resources, highly paid. You can't test the whole breadth of it. If there is something, it always gets booted all the way back to the early stages of development again. Operate and defend, sort of tie them both into the same one. Sort of, the traditional WAFs and API gateways, typically signature-based. And so they don't pick up a lot of the business logic flaws that are the #1 attack vectors, or the #1 in terms of API breaches at the moment. So I want to do a quick example. Anyone heard of Venmo before? No? One at the back, awesome. So Venmo basically is a peer-to-peer payment platform. They're owned by PayPal. And it's kind of like, split the bill, split the cab home, that sort of thing. It's meant to be the social way to pay. And by default, all the historical transactions were marked as public. Now, I don't want to drain it too much, but I just want to call out that, the exploit was a result of the lack of a number of controls, both on the left and on the right. So there was weak API design in terms of unauthenticated APIs. While there was rate limiting, it was done at a gateway level and was very coarse. So they were still able to get hundreds of thousands of transactions out per day while still fitting within that coarse-grained API limiting. One that's probably a bit concerning for me was the corporate policy they had. So all they did really was to change their privacy policy and say, well, you should mark it as private, and they reduced some of that coarse-grained rate limiting, right? The interesting side story about this was someone took this and built a bot that looked up the transactional descriptions of the payment and did a lookup on known drug terms and slangs and emojis, and then did a name and shame campaign that if he thought that you were a drug user or you did a drug transaction, he'll post it up on Twitter for you. So don't wish anyone Godspeed, because you'll probably end up on the things, right? I just want to flash this up really quickly. I expect many of you may have seen this before. So it's the OWASP top 10 for APIs, not too different to the AppSec, even though there's some commonality, such as the injections and improper asset management. But some of the subsequent slides, I anchor back to some of these exploits. So what does Shield write? Other than a buzzword, bing, someone back there. From our perspective, it's all about runtime, right? What you can do in terms of increasing your inventory visibility, the granularity of what you can see, how you can start looking at more advanced posture assessment, including misconfiguration, and then how you can start using AI and ML to move into behavioral-based anomaly detection, particularly when it comes to things like business logic. By contrast, shift left, been around a lot longer, probably less of a buzzword, but it's all about capturing and remediating defects earlier on in the pipeline, where rework is lower, and ideally before it gets into production. So I want to run through a couple of examples and the linkage between the right and the left that can help, right? So the first one I'll run through is the improper asset management. So given we're about halfway there, and some of the stats I've given you, show of hands, who thinks they've got a really good view of their API inventory? I see a few, a little bit like that, a little bit like that. That's consistent with that report I showed, about half of them, right? And very timely in terms of this event. The Hacker News, not even a week ago, 9th of September, listed API visibility as the #1 most commonly overlooked security risk, right? And I laughed the other day because I was at an event elsewhere, and it was dominated by the ASD Essential 8. And yes, you've got to get the basics right, and with API inventory, that's a basic, right? So you need to know where your APIs are. You need to keep that documentation up to scratch, right? There's that famous Chinese proverb, the more acquaintances you have, the less you know. So as API growth is exploding, you need to find a way of automation to try and keep abreast of all of that, right? Quick example, API inventories, it's not only where and how many you've got, but start getting into some of the rich information behind it. Again, that same CISO conversation I had, he said, hey, all of our external APIs are authenticated. And then it was only later on that he found out that it was basic authentication or weak authentication. So having rich visibility that can be surfaced very quickly and easily is quite useful in terms of that overall governance. Finding out whether the APIs are internet accessible and if it's via HTTP or HTTPS. Going one step further, identifying the packets and the payloads within that API traffic, and then being able to correlate those personalities together. So do you have sensitive data types, and is it internet accessible with HTTP? Obviously not a good combo, right? Then looking at things like who are the users of those APIs, how frequently are they used, are they being routed through a perimeter firewall or through an API gateway? Quite a few of our engagements, up to 30 or 40% of the APIs that we see at the perimeter firewall bypass the API gateway. Oh, on the previous slide, one nice function that we've got, again against governance, is having an advanced capability about being able to take something like your open API spec and monitor live traffic in real time against that spec, and then being able to alert on any deviations from that spec. So particularly sensitive data types again, right? It really helps with that governance. No spec, no matter. That's another little tagline. So one of the benefits of advanced tooling is you can sniff the wire and retrospectively generate an open API spec. And it's based on observed traffic, so there's still a little bit of QA to be done around it. But something as simple as this really helps with that technological debt. In fact, one of the customers we have who's have tens of thousands of XML SOAP, a whole bunch of different APIs, suffer from poor documentation. Just the man hours required to go and generate all of those specs compared to used automated tooling almost stood the business case up for itself. A couple more examples around ShieldRite. Bowler, everyone know what Bowler is? No? So the common analogy they use for describing Bowler, and it's the #1 attack in terms of OWASP, is the cloakroom, right? So turn up to the cloakroom, you hand over your stuff, you get a token, you disappear for the day. There's nothing stopping you manipulating that token. changing a 6, turning it upside down, making a 9, or making a 6 into an 8. And you go back to the cloakroom operator and you hand over the token that's been manipulated. They say, hey, you've got a token, it all must be good, and they hand over whatever corresponds to that token. So it sounds pretty simple, but in the API world, authorization at an object level and a function level is pretty difficult to do. By way of example, I don't know if you can see it. In this instance, we've done a capture of the payloads. We can see Benjamin has come in, he's been authenticated, he's received his bearer token, and he's successfully retrieved his account balance, right? Now, these bearer tokens normally have a lifespan on it, at least you hope so, or else that would also be one of the, misconfigurations that we talked about. So he's subsequently come back in again and manipulated that token, that cloakroom token, but he's still authenticated, he's still got validity, and so in this instance, he's been able to exfiltrate Charlotte's information, right? Now, the cloakroom analogy is probably a bit simplistic, but it's probably better because when you swap your token for the goods, it's a single-use token. Whereas in the API world, you can, as I mentioned, they're time-bound, so you can repeat this process quickly at the speed of APIs. And this is very common how data gets exfiltrated out of systems. Alyssa Knight, I don't know if anyone's heard of Alyssa Knight, but she's a reforming hacker. It's part of our advisory board. And she actually went and showed that 100% of the APIs that she tested in the US were susceptible to Ebola, right? Mapping it back a little bit, we can see why it broke down, right? There was weak design done at the development stage. The testing tooling that was in place clearly wasn't adequate to pick up those business logic abuses. And then we know operate and protect the WAF gateways, et cetera, typically look at signature-based, right? Quick example of shifting left. As mentioned, developers, all about functionality. I think our guys outside, Postman, have done a survey that can back me up on that. But this puts the burden of security on teams who frequently resort to pen testing, or they don't have the timing or the tools to be able to do it all. So one way of helping alleviate that is to get incrementally sophisticated testing integrated natively into the pipeline, so it's non-intrusive, and to test frequently and often. We talk about continuous integration, continuous development, deployment. Why not continuous testing? Right? Just some eye candy around some of the test suites that are built into the Noname platform. While the title may be a little bit misleading around uniting the left and the right, and I'm not back at politics, as I wrap up the kind of presentation, I want to focus predominantly, my focus has predominantly been on the technology, but we mustn't lose sight of the fact that there are other people and processes involved in the whole life cycle from cradle to grave or from cradle to reincarnation. It starts with planning, and so this is a view our CISO has put together around the top 20 controls around APIs, right? Move through to developing, to making sure there's appropriate training and tooling, through to testing, making sure we're using the right testing tool for the job. So SAS, DAST, SCA has still got a very important part to play in it. It's just making sure that you use the right tool for the job, and as we know, most jobs require multiple tools. Right? Moving through into that operate, we touched on that inventory, we touched around sensitive data movement, and being able to feed that back into the protect. So being able to detect when there's a deviation in normal API patterns and do something about it. Noname engine, as you can see, it pretty much unifies the right and the left. So we can ingest API traffic from network clouds, API gateways, do correlation between those personalities, surface that real-time rich inventory, integrate with existing workflows so you don't have a massive retooling effort to be done, and of course, integrate with the existing developer tooling. Want to know more? We've got a couple of virtual academies that we're running, and we've also got a technical workshop. I think the next one is next month, where you can get hands-on, and we play blue team, red team aspect. And for those who are CISSP or looking to do so, we've recently got it accredited for CPEs. Although I think it's meant to say 4, not 40. With that, I'll welcome any questions.
I think, generally with security, I find a lot of the time
That's a very good question, and something we struggle with a little bit, to be honest, because you're talking about ROI based on risk, and how do you quantify risk effectively, right? So they say to you, well, Gartner quantifies a breach as, there's the talk, keep walking. So what we do try and do is the two aspects of it, look at how we can accelerate the DevOps velocity, and those are sort of things where you can get that telemetry from. How much rework there is because of API security, assuming you've got that. And part of our approach is to do a proof of value. So deploy it, try before you buy. Because of the way that some of the solutions are deployed, it's out of band, takes an asynchronous copy of the data. It's pretty disruptive and pretty quick to do. So being a startup, we kind of lead with product-led growth initiatives. Any other questions?
What's your thoughts on the fragmentation of the security landscape? It's extremely fragmented. Every year there's a new niche vendor providing a niche solution.
One. Hundreds.
Yeah. And then we wonder why there's a holistic issue with vendor management where third parties are largely at risk.
Yeah.
The security vendors themselves end up being part of the problem. I think it's all.
No, I hear you, and I think that's one of the reasons why we take an ecosystem approach to our market as well, right? So very similar to what Spot has done. We don't care what you've got out there. We're not ripping and replacing anything. Keep investing what you've already got there. It does its job well. Let us just correlate those feeds and give you an enriched view of the end-to-end environment. So it's an incremental plus one as opposed to rip and replace, which sort of half answers your question. It's still yet another vendor, but yeah.
That makes sense.
Any more questions? Okay, bang on time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for listening.